Rodney Sampson, he's up from Atlanta. He is the chairman of Opportunity Hub. He's a partner and co-founder in TechSquare Labs. He's also an entrepreneur himself. So let's give a big round of applause to Rodney. So let's jump right in. Nice icebreaker where we like to ask the people at these keynotes is tell us one thing about yourself that we're not going to see on your LinkedIn profile or we're not going to see in your official bio.
I have 6 kids.
Whoa.
6?
Yeah.
That's prolific.
Yeah.
Excellent.
One person. Let's get that.
That's right.
What are their ages, like range?
Youngest is 3, oldest is 16.
Oh, wow.
And they're like,
Excellent.
I'm exhausted just thinking about that.
yes.
Very impressive.
So as I mentioned, you are an entrepreneur yourself. You've started 4 companies, had 2 exits, and 2
Failures.
what are they?
Failures.
Oh, failures. Okay. See? Why don't you tell us about how you became an entrepreneur? Like, what's your origin story?
So it's good to be here. First time in Maine, and first time in Portland. I've been getting my fair share of lobster in, so.
We know how to take care of you.
Absolutely. Jess, thanks for the invitation as well. Oh, wow. So 16 years ago, I was actually in transition from, actually went to Penn State College of Medicine. So after undergraduate, I went to medical school. And during that period, I noticed that managed care was coming in and was like sucking out the entrepreneurial spirit, for physicians. And I saw the culture at Penn State literally just shift and change. And I was like, I want no part of this. And so I actually had 2 rotations left in medical school, surgery and then an elective. Had already taken my first boards. If I went down that rabbit hole, I felt like it was just a path of no return. So I withdrew from medical school, moved back to Atlanta, got an MBA program, and was actually working at a church. So I was running the day-to-day operations of a church, and one Sunday, the sheriff came in and served the pastor during the service because he was behind in his media payments for the large TV networks like TBN and BET and all the TV networks. Okay. So a part of taking the position, I required that I have a computer and that the church bring a T1 line into the community, which back then bringing a T1 line into community was like closing the digital divide where this church was. It was a major initiative. And so I saw a press release where Mark Cuban had sold broadcast.com to AOL for billions of dollars. That's how Mark made his money. And so I started ideating. We didn't call it ideation back then, but I started thinking about how could I help this particular church reach more people but save money. And so I kind of sketched out the business model for a company that became known as StreamingFaith.com. Well, we had a parent company called Multicast Media Networks. So I was a business co-founder. I'm not a technical co-founder, so I'm not an engineer. So I knew I needed technical co-founders kind of in order to fit into what was starting to form as Atlanta's startup community, particularly around tech, particularly around the Georgia tech community. So my 2 co-founders were actually securities lawyers, imagine that. And one actually was a technical engineer, so he could code in essence. And so that's essentially how I got started. Solving a problem, it was a some would consider a niche problem that was kind of hyper-local, hyper-cultural in a sense. And we teach startups now, build something that solves a problem that people are willing to pay for. A lot of people are solving things that they just want to solve, but no one's willing to pay for. And that's kind of the definition, of a real business. It's something folks are willing to pay for. And so that's how I kind of got into tech. We built that company, and it was eventually acquired by Kit Digital for about $20 million. Yeah.
So one of the successes.
That was one of the successes, with pain points along the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about, you want to talk about one of the failures, maybe in lessons from that?
Yeah. In reality, I've learned more from my failures than I actually have from the successes. So let's see, one of the failures, we were early pioneers in the SMS monetization market. So basically making money over SMS messaging, whether it was monthly subscriptions, monthly donations. And this was kind of our first round with the reality that policy still impacts business in America. And it also has an impact on innovation as well, particularly very untested innovation. So we developed strong MVPs, have started developing customers, and then basically the carriers were like, no, we need to take 50% of your revenue, because essentially the product allowed us to send content over SMS messages that was charged to the subscriber's monthly bill. Mm-hmm. And at first, I don't think the carriers, kind of figured out what was going on. They were taking a small percentage, and they came back and said, we want to take 50%. And we couldn't basically build a business off that. So we shut it down. But that experience, I actually learned the process of how policies become laws and how laws are enforced, whether it's the federal, state, municipal level. I mean, it's kind of a step above, that Saturday morning cartoon on how a bill progresses. But it was that process that allowed me, when I got more actively involved in the Jobs Act and participating kind of as an early advocate on capital formation and how it starts and how you can, support and kind of unofficially lobby things that you want to push forward rather than kind of waiting on the day to vote or respond to something that was voted on. So that process allowed me to learn something that I now apply quite frequently now.
In your when you meet with founders today, and they're sort of at that point of either immediately post what they would consider failure, or they're talking about failure, how do you talk to them about working through that process and how to get the best learning out of that? It's a very painful event, right?
Sure.
You put your heart and soul into this, but sometimes failure becomes the fancy part of the conversation when it's really the learning, right?
It's true. I guess everything is sort of kind of communicated in hashtags these days. So I'll give you my hashtag. Hashtag failure is not fraud.
You can tweet that.
Yeah, you can. Actually, failure is not fraud, meaning that when you fail, when your startup fails, particularly for those who've actually raised capital and you actually raise a seed round, $500,000, $1 million, and your startup fails.
You've taken people's money.
You've taken people's money in exchange for equity or what have you. It's still okay to fail. Maybe you just didn't get traction. Maybe you didn't get customers. Maybe you lost that key, team members. Maybe the market shift. But the unlearned startup enthusiasts tend to view failure as kind of the outlier when it's actually the norm. It should be normal inside of your startup ecosystem for you to fail. As the startup community, it's our responsibility to learn how to fail fast and to pivot. And actually, we see this in businesses that we invest in and co-founders that we invest in, is that the first iteration of their MVP may not be the product that actually makes that company successful. And they may go through several iterations of that. Now, internally, managing pain is tough for all people. Most people tend to want to anesthetize their pain and not deal with it. I could apply that to just kind of the American construct and just society in general. We have pain points, their cultural pain points, their racial pain points, their gender pain points, et cetera, that our country just many times would rather not even talk about and just kind of erase and act like, oh, everything's kind of like Willy Wonka. And when you do that, you really don't maximize kind of your potential because you're not solving things that hurt. And if you solve something that actually hurts, whether that's internal or external, then you'll kind of discover your definitive purpose. I think it was Napoleon Hill, and not to get all spooky on everybody because I know we're talking startups, but he's got a book out called Outwitting the Devil, and he's having this conversation with this enemy in his head, and he talks about why do most so Napoleon Hill is asking the devil himself, basically, why do 98% of humans drift through life and never discover their purpose? And they have good jobs, they have families, they have spouses, they have children, they've got lake homes, they've got exits, you name it, but they live life unfulfilled. And it's because they don't really turn and address the pain points that have kind of been assigned to them to have to deal with, not for their own personal gain, but for the gain of others that would learn from those experiences. And so I apply that to kind of, our startup ecosystem, particularly in Atlanta, but also as I move around the country as well. So kind of productizing solutions to pain is where you find a lot of I guess your unicorns, right? Yeah.
There's a lot of mystical things in there, the devil and the unicorns. I like how you wove that all together.
Yeah, I haven't even had a drink yet either. That lobster.
That's right.
So you're Fairman chairman of Opportunity Hub. You were co-founder, partner in TechSquare Labs in Atlanta.
Sure.
And at TechSquare Labs, you head up diversity and inclusion initiatives. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Opportunity Hub and TechSquare Labs, and then we'll get into the diversity conversation as well.
Sure. So kind of piggybacking on that whole Napoleon Hill definitive purpose thing, after you've been building companies and hiring people and scaling and failing and selling and negotiating, you can get burnt out after a while. And so I went through this period of time where I was really trying to discover, why am I here? Why was I created? Why did I survive my pain points and issues and isms and schisms, et cetera? And I started reading the works of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who's an Atlantan, iconic Atlantan, but particularly paying attention to his economic ideals. And most people would say he was just civil and social justice. He didn't have any economic ideals, and he actually did. The last few years of his life were actually focused on economic policy. I think it got dwarfed by his kind of outspoken narrative on the Vietnam War. But if you really dig into his last work, Chaos or Community, where do we go from here? He was starting to talk about, post the 1964 Civil Rights Bill and the 65 Voting Rights Act, what was next in terms of equity and parity for a group of disenfranchised Americans. He was planning the Poor People's Campaign when he was assassinated. He was killed. And he was in Memphis fighting for equity and parity among sanitation workers. Right, so I really got pulled into that, and I started then studying kind of our nation's wealth gap, and I started looking at the racial wealth gap in particular, and started looking at just the U.S. Census data and Pew Research, and just kind of looking at, if you take, some quick data points, I'm going somewhere. So average net worth of a white American family in America today is about $140,000+. Asian American is $100,000. There's a reason that's because of their interest in technology, engineering, et cetera. So you can see how that gap is closed. Latino Americans, which I know you have a large Latino population, it's about $13,000, and then African Americans is about $11,000. That's average net worth. Now that's not everybody's net worth, because there are about 400,000 African Americans today have a net worth over $1 million. Will be considered, accredited investors or what have you. So the data are averages or what have you. And so inside of Kingonomics, I started looking at Dr. King's principles and said, okay, how can I tell his story through my lens and my experiences, but kind of put forth a roadmap of closing the wealth gap by diversifying the innovation, entrepreneurship, and investment economies. We call that the startup ecosystem. Economists call it that, but we call it kind of startup world in a sense. And so Kingonomics was released. It was national release, major publisher, did very well. Yeah. That evolved into a large-scale conference we did in Atlanta on King Weekend, and 800 people showed up for that first conference. And actually, we live streamed because I could not do a conference, having had a live streaming company. I had to live stream it, and we had a few thousand people show up for the live stream as well. And so I did a survey of the crowd and kind of my own customer discovery throughout the day. And I said, as small business owners or entrepreneurs or startups or those with ideas, what do you require, or what do you believe you require to actually build your business? And the first thing people said, well, a meeting space where I don't feel invisible. That was kind of a resounding trend. When I walk into a space, and I knew what that space was, we call them co-working spaces, we call them incubators, we call them entrepreneurial centers. There's so many names that sort of kind of define it. There's a lot of ambiguity on terminologies. I mean, major corporations, major banks are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars just to do reports on defining what these centers are. I'm like, why don't you just come ask us, and we'll tell you, and we can take that money and repurpose it.
Or give it to us, and we'll tell them, and then we'll use them.
Yeah, exactly. But having a meeting place where people felt like, even as a startup co-founder, or even as someone that's traditionally not seen in the startup world, that I would be seen as visible when I walked in. And the second thing is there would be mentors there that could relate to my journey, whether they succeeded or failed. And what I mean is, for instance, if you are that startup who has raised your first $50,000 to $100,000 as a convertible note or a safe note, and then you go on to, sell another 10% of your company for an amount, that's a milestone that most startups never reach. So that's a success that you can pay it forward by teaching someone. You don't have to have an exit to actually be a mentor. Mm-hmm. You just have to have a win or a success that you're willing to teach people along the way. So having mentors that could relate to their journey was important. And also having mentors that looked like them, whether that was age-wise, whether that was ethnic-wise, whether that was gender-wise. People felt comfortable just being able to sit down with someone who looked like them, or they perceived looked like them, who had basically walked in their path or what have you. So that was the second thing. The third thing was really access to networks and connections, and we call that kind of the ecosystem in general. Like, how do you actually get to Steve Case to pitch him? And it's like, well, that's an email away. But for us, but for that person who's just entering, it's like Steve Case is so far away. They don't have that 2 degrees or 6 degrees of separation. And then the fourth thing was around capital formation in terms of that early stage access to capital. Where do you go and get, what is family and friends capital? Do you even know what it is? What is an angel investor? What's a pre-seed? What's a seed? What's a price round? All of these things that we may take for granted because it's the lingo of our community. And so that's how the Opportunity Hub was born 4 years ago. And so we quickly grew. Our first campus was 8,000 square feet. We outgrew that, and then we expanded to 2 campuses totaling 17 plus 1,000 square feet. One in downtown Atlanta and a kind of revived, upperly mobile part of town, and the other one on the west side of town, not too far actually from Martin Luther King's birth home. So we were able to experience a quest for entrepreneurship in 2 different economic communities, and some would argue that those on the west side just didn't, they didn't want enough, so they weren't in the conversation, whereas I can make the argument that those who have don't want more than what they should, so we did that for 3 years, and then at the end of last year, I got a call from guy by the name of Paul Judge, another iconic entrepreneur, and Alan Nance said, listen, we just bought this building. It's an old Office Depot near Georgia Tech, and you've been ecosystem building. How about we come together? And so we were acquired last year and merged with what is now called TechSquare Labs. So today we have 25,000 square feet of space in Midtown Atlanta. We own the property, so there's no mortgage. That helps when you're building these ecosystems. We have our own coding initiative, which is a joint venture with the Iron Yard. We're literally taking disconnected youth. We have a partnership. I think I'm going ahead, so I'll come back to that. And we just recently closed on a $25 million seed fund. So we're actively investing in companies as well.
I want to go back to the mentor, building the mentor network, because this is something, there's a fair number, just a quick glance, there's a fair number of mentors in the room, but also people who are interested in building mentor networks. This idea about building a mentor network that reflects the type of founders that you're trying to support. It seems like a really important point, right? We've talked about in the past the Kaufman study where they say aspirations for greatness are contagious, but that contagiousness only takes root if people can identify with their mentor, right? Is that right?
That's true.
And have you seen that? Have you seen that be a successful model in OHUB?
I have, and when it comes to kind of our quest to be the most diverse and inclusive ecosystem on the planet. And if you come to Atlanta and you schedule a tour, you probably would agree. I mean, to walk literally in this place and one side of the campus, we've got 15 disconnected youth that people probably would have written off that just actually last Friday finished 12 weeks of full-time immersive coding, learning Java, which is a very tough language, it's an enterprise language to learn, so they've been learning Java. And right across the hall, so let's say they're all African American, but right across the hall we have Stanley Black & Decker, which is a large company that's trying to figure out its future, and we house their innovation accelerator, their internal accelerator, and you've got mostly white male engineers. But what happens in the break room, what happens over the foosball table is you see people who their commonality is code, right? And so they start talking about object-oriented, blah, 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 stuff I'm like...
Non-technical co-founder.
Exactly, right? Non-technical. But so sometimes that mentorship can develop because there's something else that's common, and you have to be intentional about doing that. So usually people, just by nature, I think humans tend to take the least difficult path in everything, meaning, I'm going to be around people who think like me because they're not going to challenge me. I'm going to be around people who look like me because they look like me and I look like them. But disruptive communities and innovative people, or people who have been forced to kind of assimilate into other cultures, actually thrive off the ability to find commonality in people that are different from themselves. And so, just to make that plain and candid as I am, there's something that white males in America can learn from, let's say, young black men in America, or black females. Same thing with white women and black women, or men. So you can learn something from the person that when you first see them, you automatically think that you have nothing in common with them. And the reality of it is, if you from my medical school days, if you deconstruct an African American cadaver and you deconstruct a white cadaver, you'd be surprised of the similarities in the anatomical structure all the way down.
If someone is surprised, we've got a really big problem.
Right. Yeah. There's some places you'd be surprised.
Yeah, that's right.
But my point is, I think to overcome overcomplicate this again. We're here to simplify things.
That's
I think
right.
you have to overcomplicate it first, is when you're developing a mentorship network, it's not just enough to say, okay, I've got a black co-founder, let me connect him with a black mentor. You'd be surprised how that black co-founder can learn from that white mentor at the same time. And it could be some point of interest. It might be like sport enthusiasts or something, or a team, but it's some point of connection,
right,
of common ground that, in community building can be sought out. And so we actually had to sit down with our mentors and our startup co-founders and teach how to do that. How to actually go outside of your comfort zone and get to know people who don't live where you live, who don't think where you think, who don't do what you do on a regular basis. And then we saw this kind of organic mentorship network take hold. So today we've got over 50 mentors and residents that volunteer their time to come in and spend time with our co-founders, and it's an amazing thing. But we had to work on it. But I think we had to do a little mind shifting in the process, because when people come into the startup world, they don't leave all their hang-ups at home. They bring everything with them. And building businesses from the ground up, another hashtag we say is build something from nothing. When you're building something from nothing, that in itself is stressful enough. Having to deal with the nuances of just how your respective community or society works and how you fit into that can add additional pressure. Some people will say, well, look, when I get rich and wealthy, I'll deal with it then. And some people will say, well, as I'm building, I don't want to deal with it. But what we've learned is you have to find the opportunities to deal with it as you go, because time is neutral. Actually, Dr. King said this, time is neutral. And some folks say, well, let's just give it time. Let's just, in time, things will change. They won't change unless we change them. And we have to be very intentional about that engagement, particularly around creating mentors, because if you have a weak mentor network, you have a weak ecosystem.
Yeah.
On the diversity topic, we talked about diversity of mentorship.
Yeah.
How about diversity of teams? Say, do you have any advice for startup founders who want to be deliberate about making sure that they're not creating an echo chamber? They actually want to create a diverse team. How should they go about doing that?
Absolutely. Well, I think diversity is very broad. It's a broad construct. They're the obvious ones that we deal with, just like the different hues of our respective skin and our mindsets and our upbringing and all of those different educational backgrounds, all those things. But when you're building a company, and I'll talk from our perspective, because we invest exclusively in technical co-founders. Our investment thesis, which if you're raising capital, every investor, whether they're an angel, venture capitalist, whatever stage of investor you're talking to, they all have a thesis. And many times you may not be successful in raising capital because you're asking the wrong people for money. Because if someone invests in consumer products, then you should not be talking to them about software or vice versa. So it's not like you talk to every investor and see if I can convince you because your idea is so great or your product is so great. If you have an enterprise software product, you have to talk to investors at that stage. So as an individual practice and also as our fund's thesis, we only invest in technical co-founders, meaning your team has to have at least one technical co-founder on it that has the capacity to build your software MVP. It also, so that could be one person, that could be two persons. So initial diversity is real simple. When you build a company, someone has to build it, someone has to sell it. So if you've got two people who can sell but no one can build, you can't build a company. And if you got two people who can build but no one can sell and close, you also don't have a company because you can't get customers. So the first diversity should just be the technical diversity. Can I get a technical person to build, and can I get a technical person to sell? And there could be some overlap there. So the very reason it's called a team means there's not just a solo co-founder. And I don't frown upon solo co-founders because everybody has their own personal journey. But what I've learned is two can do more than one. And it's just great balance, particularly if you're raising money from smart investors. Back to the investor thing, there's what we call smart capital, and not to be pejorative, but we call it dumb capital. Not dumb people, it's just dumb capital, because that person may not be have domain expertise in that particular industry. So dumb capital may say, oh, I really like this person, they built it, they're selling it, they're one-man show, one-man lady, they can do it all. Whereas smart capital is going to know for you to go the distance, you're going to have a team. And having an equitable co-founding team at the beginning means you're willing to partner up with someone and actually split the pie. There's a blog, Founders and Funders. I think it's Funders and Founders or Founders and Funders. It has a nice infographic that says when building a company from idea to exit, what's equitable? If it's a 2-member team, we recommend 50-50. If it's a 3-person team, that once you get beyond 4 or 5, that's more like a committee, and you can't really get anything done that way. So, but when addressing diversity, I think look at the skill set initiative or the potential of the skill set. I'm kind of reminded of the Facebook movie, right? When Zuck was there and was like, oh, we need somebody in marketing. And the guy who was just like leaning on the wall that just happened to be in the dorm room where they were, hacking, right? It wasn't like, well, he's got 3 years of experience in integrated lifecycle marketing at a social media network, MySpace. Like there was only one before, right, that had gotten traction here in the US. The guy was just in the right place on the wall learning about marketing and became the chief marketing officer of Facebook. So there's a proximity of opportunity. Well, if you have the proximity of the local, Maine ecosystem, and you don't see diverse talent here, and that could be cultural diversity, that could be gender diversity, you name it. If it's not here, if you're going to have a thriving ecosystem long term that matches up with enterprise decision makers, but also consumers, who are ultimately customers, you're going to have racial and gender diversity on your team. The McKesson study, right?
McKinsey, yeah.
McKinsey
study, that's right. We were talking about this.
35 to 40% increase on return on investment when there's diversity, either gender or ethnic diversity on the co-founding team. If the angel community and the venture community were to get a clue about just that data and the similar reports, they would be demanding diversity in co-founding teams, because the failure rate in the angel and venture world, we make 40 bets knowing that half of them are going to fail, right? And the other 20, out of the next 10, we may break even, and we're looking for that one unicorn and maybe 3 or 4 to kind of do well just to get a 10x return over a 10-year. It's a broken methodology. If you're telling me through the diversity of co-founding teams, I can potentially increase, or the data shows I can increase my return on investment at 35%, if you say you are a smart investor, you would be more intentional about encouraging and demanding diversity on teams. And that might be amongst technical co-founders, early hires, board of advisors, etc. But the intentionality of it is what I think is important. And sometimes when they're not here, so I was talking about how to build up, from what I learned from Jess over lobsters last evening, was that on the weekends you've got an additional 3 million people who flood into...
In the summer.
In the summer, right? They flood here. That means people know about Maine. And it's like, well, you may have to have an initiative to actually attract talent that's not here to come here. And so you've got to create a belonging and opening community. You've got to look at, where did you go to undergraduate, right? How many of you went to undergraduate outside of Portland, Maine? The majority of you, right? Just to dig in a little bit, most colleges are going to have like the Black Student Union. They're going to have the Latino Student Union. And you think back and you're going to say like, wow, I never participated in any of those groups. And, maybe I saw events on the events calendar, what have you. But that is a network. Start looking at your alumni network, and maybe there's someone that has a skill set that you're looking for. And maybe they're willing to come to Portland to build that startup. Look at the other organizations that already exist that are here. Now, long term, if you're going to diversify your ecosystem, we've got to look at kind of what are your K through 12 strategies, right? And your 12 through 16. What are you exposing those rural areas? And there's another type of diversity. You got the urban centers and your rural centers. You were telling me about where the paper mills, the two largest paper mills had closed. So you've got antiquated skill sets, but people who still have to live and provide for themselves. So how are those people being acclimated into the innovation economy? Are you introducing coding at the K through 5 and in the high school? Are you introducing software engineering or machine learning, which is where the jobs of the future? So you've got to kind of look at it, what can you do now, but also what is the what's the long-term goal? We were having this conversation over breakfast this morning. I was saying, intentional or non-intentional, unconscious or conscious, biased people who depend on classism or racism as a tool of greed, have a short-range view, because ageism will eventually catch up with you. And then you become dependent on a generation of people that you have isolated yourself from, whether that is your customer or whether that is your caregiver. And so you kind of look at the long term.
Yeah.
You told me I could be candid.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Okay.
No, absolutely.
Right.
I mean, I just want to touch on this topic more because, the elephant in the room is that we don't have a very diverse entrepreneurial community here in Portland, as evidenced by the audience today. But that's not to say we don't have a diverse population demographic here in Portland. So, I don't know if there's more we can talk about how do we better integrate.
Let's talk about on-ramps.
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 You said time is neutral, so it's not just going to happen, right? We got to be intentional about it.
Well, one thing is
On-ramps.
when you travel to startup communities around the world, with the exclusion of Asia and Africa, because they are actually building some amazing startup communities. There are over 30 entrepreneurial centers today on the continent of Africa. And they are mostly technology focused, solving some amazing problems. That's probably the only place on the planet outside of what we do in Atlanta where you will see more men and women of color building companies from the ground up. So in America, you're pretty much homogenized, whether you are in Silicon, this is like Silicon Valley right here. This is what you have. If outside of the capital, I know they've got more capital, but basically this is what Silicon Valley looks like when I go and when I give talks, or we go and check out deals or what have you. So don't feel too bad. You're not the only one. Okay. You fit right in. But therein lies the opportunity. So if you look at it from an on-ramp perspective, I'm really data-driven. So I couldn't find a lot of data in a short period of time on kind of the ethnic demo of Maine. From what I was able to discover was that most of your ethnicity is in the South, which normally is in the South, southern part of was that Portland, South Portland, or what have you. And then inside of Portland itself, I'm sure there's a community where most of your African Americans or most of your Latinos live. Now, if you don't have that, then you've accomplished what most American cities have not accomplished in terms of true diversification on the housing side. But as we all know, most housing in America still is pretty segregated, either by choice or by redlining and other respective policies. So, but identifying people and then starting to introduce those people to the startup community, calling them, emailing them. A lot of people who work in corporations that may be in Maine because their job is here. A lot of times it's those professionals that will pivot into entrepreneurship and small business. They work inside of a company, inside of a supply chain, and they know the problems because they deal with them day in and day out. That's the perfect person sometimes to pivot and start a company, and sometimes the company they work for could be the first customer. And so if your politicians were here today, I would say let's look at it from a policy perspective as well. What does it look like in terms of minority opportunity to contracts? Are women getting contracts, right? Or is it just assumed that women don't want contracts? Like the women are like, you didn't ask us. Like, we want contracts, or minorities or immigrants or what have you. Atlanta was intentional about doing this in the 70s. So when George Wallace, who was a segregationist governor, basically put his foot down and said segregation yesterday, today, and tomorrow.
In Alabama.
In Birmingham, in Alabama. There's no perfect utopia when it comes to race and culture, because they're people, and I think whenever you have differences amongst people, you will always have conflict. I think that's the human experience, period. I mean, if we were to thrive towards utopia, there would be nothing to solve, and there would be no startup communities, and we wouldn't, so there's always going to be tension, because I think that's what makes us better as a person. So, but industry tends sometimes to make smart decisions, and so Delta Airlines and a lot of other airlines said, we're pulling out of Alabama. This is the late 60s. And where were they to go? So Atlanta said, we want to attract Delta, and Delta says, well, you have to build us an airport. Now we're into the early 70s, right? And so Maynard Jackson, first African-American mayor of Atlanta, and that's called Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, so when you fly through, that's that Jackson. Basically said 35% of all contracts and airport concessions in this new airport have to go to women and minorities, or you can't build it here. And Delta also, you have to look at your vendors and also allocate to qualified vendors to actually start their companies that can do the work, right? So we're not talking about folks just getting contracts and can't do the work, but can actually do the work to get those opportunities. And what it did was it made Atlanta what it is today. Birmingham, by all intents and purposes, should have been Atlanta. We're both landlocked, so it's not like we have a coast or any type of water that's nearby that's a differentiator. We're both landlocked, and actually Birmingham is geographically larger. And so what you look at it as Atlanta today, it was supposed to be Birmingham. But because their policy was kind of stuck in the dark ages, but their industry was progressive. So look at your policies around inclusion in contracts, and you can start there, because sometimes developing small businesses can also spur innovation, right? It may be traditional contracting opportunities that people notice pain points, and then they're off hiring an engineer or partnering up with somebody to do something. So look at it at the policy level. Your major companies, the Fortune level companies that are here, what have you, what are their policies around not just hiring diverse talent, but also working with diverse suppliers as well. And looking at your professional community that's here. I mean, just over dinner, we were having conversations that, the pastor of the AME church, his daughter went to Howard University in Washington, D.C., and the fact that she came back says something about Portland, because once she got to Washington, once she got to the nation's capital, she could have said, look, I'm out. I'm not going back to Portland, but she came back, right? So, you've got diverse talent here, but it's actually being authentic about engaging that talent. Like for tonight, right? There's this Represent event where black and brown professionals are coming together. I actually expect to see some of you there.
Right. Does everyone know about this event? It's at what time?
Did I give it out?
No, 5:30.
5:30. It's at Red Thread, which is One City Center.
Yeah. And just, that's how it starts, right? And then it's just that simple human construct where it's like small conversations, and you realize that people at the end of the day have essentially the same goals. They basically want to be able to take care of themselves, their family, and pay it forward in some small way. And so the startup ecosystem allows us to kind of accelerate that, right? You get a high growth company, you can create more jobs, it's not just a lifestyle business. And so now you've got job creation. What happens when you're in the position where you've got to hire 10 people, and now you can sit back and not just point fingers at the large corporations and say, you should hire diverse talent, you should hire more women. Now you've got 10 job openings, you go hire women, you go hire immigrants, you go hire minorities, or you go give an opportunity and take some money and take that guy who worked in the paper mill until he was 50. Now he doesn't have a job, send him back to learn machine learning, right? So that he can now get a new career. So those are the types of things that I think that we can be very intentional about doing. And then simply, and I'll just kind of close this statement right here, if you can go about your daily life, whether it's building your company, working at your company, going to your child's school for PTA meetings, going to your church, and the majority of the people that you interact with, and this applies to black, brown, gay, straight, you name it, if the majority of people that you interact with are like you, I think you're living beneath your privilege. I think that you're living beneath your privilege. There is a world of opportunity and things to discover, people, networks, customers, you name it. And maybe you just like a mundane life. If that's you, cool. But I don't think you do, because that's why you're here today. Yeah. But it's like, look at your internal networks. Look at your Facebook friends. Look at your LinkedIn profiles or your Twitter followers. And why don't you start following interesting people that are different than you, and start looking at their threads and start learning. Some of you are already looking at your friends, right? Start learning and just that expose yourself to other cultures. Because what's interesting, I was actually having this conversation with Mark Cuban. So what he didn't say in my introductions, for 2 years, I was the executive.
There was just too much. I couldn't get to it all.
Executive in charge of diversity for Mark Burnett Productions. And one of our properties was Shark Tank. From Shark Tank to the new Ben-Hur movie that's coming out, from Son of God movie, Mark Burnett and his wife Roma have their hands in a lot of things.
Survivor,
Celebrity Apprentice, The Voice. And they're really strong about their Christian faith. That's why they invest in the faith and family movies. And so I gave Mark a galley copy of Kingonomics before it was released, and I was doing some advisory work on one of his pictures, and just stuff I like to do on the side, right? I've got a lot going on, but I'm very, very particular about how to shape popular culture through narratives, and I think media plays a large part in that, and sometimes they do a disjustice to history, they do a disjustice to people, because what you see on TV every day, most of it is, just go out of the country and watch the same media and you get a totally different perspective or go online. So I gave Mark that, and so Mark called me up, he's like, look, I want you to come out to Malibu. We're having some problems inside of our organization. We don't have enough diverse talent. I just believe I could get more creativity if I had people from different backgrounds working on set, writing, scripted, unscripted, you name it. And so the first project he gave me was Shark Tank. And so actually that was some very empowering work. So most of the women and minorities you see on the show today were because of the policies and practices and things we put in place on that particular show. Well, Mark and I were like at break on set casting, and we kind of got into it because Mark had made this comment on an Inc. magazine entrepreneurship conference, and they were asking him about his thoughts on the Clippers owner and that whole thing that went down with his comments and everything. And because Mark was a team owner, they wanted to know what his thoughts were. And so Mark made kind of this off-the-cuff comment. He was like, well, yeah, if I'm walking down the street in Dallas and I see a black kid with a hoodie on, I'm going to cross the street. Or if I see a guy that looks like a skinhead, I'm going to cross the street. And so Mark and I got into kind of like an argument about it. And I was like, well, Mark, most of your players walk down the street in hoodies. And so, they work for you. Would you cross the street? And I said, to compare a young black male with a hoodie on, Mark Zuckerberg can go raise $1 billion or give $1 billion away and have a hoodie on and walk down the street. And compare that person to a skinhead. If you can recognize a skinhead, I think there's an archetype of one, but I think there's a mindset too, so you can't always recognize. And so we kind of got back and forth, and we were kind of going. I was like, listen, Mark, you can wake up in the morning and create $1 billion business as a white man in America and never have to interact or engage with anyone of color or women if you don't want to. You do it by choice. And so don't take that privilege for granted. I said, but most people, immigrants, minorities, women in general, so many designations. There's some new minority designation being created every day. So I think there's a lot going on in the evolution of the conversation. If we don't engage with white men on the planet, it's really hard to get ahead. You're kind of self-contained and self-isolated. And so he was like, you really think so? I was like, well, let's trade, net worth for a minute. And let me show you, right? He was like, well, you're doing pretty good for yourself. I said, yes, I am. But I said, what I learned early on was that I had to get over my hang-ups. I had to get over my biases. I had to get over myself. And if I wasn't open to going into business with my 2 Jewish co-founders, for my first tech startup, I might not be standing here today. And so I had to be intentional myself. So I think there's a mutual responsibility on minorities and people from disenfranchised communities to also be open to connecting with people that aren't like themselves. On the same token, I said, Mark, you have a responsibility to be an ally to people who are less fortunate than you. Period. Wealth comes with the responsibility. Influence comes with responsibility. Access comes with responsibility. So be great in your narrative, And I was like, you're on Shark Tank. You're on the Mavericks. You can't loose talk at a conference because you sent a message to a group of people who are holding on every word, and they're looking to reshape what you say and use it against a certain populace. And so the responsibility that comes. And so that's a message to all, but particularly those who have means, who have wealth, who lead foundations, is that responsibility to actually look outside of your lens and bring people around you so that you can see through their lens, and so that you don't have this kind of myopic echo chamber approach. But when I can see through the lens of an investor, see through the lens of an advisor, see through the lens of my customer, or see through the lens of a target market that I have not even considered. Did you know that the tipping point for most social media companies, Twitter, IG, Instagram, Periscope, even Facebook, came when young African-American millennials got on, and basically the user interactivity went up to a certain point that it tipped their valuations over into the billions, right? So if you're building a company and not thinking about diverse customer bases and diverse targets, intentional about it. Look at your customers and say, if you're a consumer-facing customer, why am I not selling to Latinos? Why am I not selling? Now, you can have this kind of false meritocracy to say, well, I'm colorblind. That's foolish. There's no such thing as colorblindness. It's a farce. You want to be color aware. You want to be differential aware. You want to see people's differences and not awkwardly inquire like, kind of the black tokenism questions that you ask, and can I touch your hair? And I never touch. But you want to be authentic about, I want to know about you. It's just like you do customer discovery in a company, do customer discovery on your personal network. And when you start doing that, like, I don't expect everybody in the room to do it, but if a remnant of you do it, and we came back together 10 years from now, I think you have a different Portland, to be honest.
Wow.
Yeah.
See you later.
Yeah, you want to drop it?
Oh, yeah, I think it's cool. Yeah.
So
Two things I want to follow up with what I think is fascinating. First of all, Robin Cannon was speaking later this week. We had a call with her. She was talking to us about her company called My Trans Health, which connects trans Americans with providers.
She's from here. She's out of Seattle.
You got it. Yeah. She has this great phrase when we were talking to her. She said, "It's not just about building a solution. It's about building the right solution."
Okay.
And so if you're trying to sell your product outside of Maine, you're going to be selling to a lot of people who don't look like Maine. And so how you build your team is about building, in many ways, about the right solution.
Absolutely.
Right? And so if you don't have those perspectives, this is a point she made very energetically with Whit and I, is that you want to bring those perspectives in-house. You don't want to just, again, it's just like we were talking about yesterday with design thinking, is that you want to do that at the beginning of the process, not deploy your MVP and be like, whoops, I guess I should have done something different.
Right.
So I think that's an interesting sort of connection between your talk and Rob's later in the week.
yeah.
The other one I want to talk about is coding, if that's okay.
Yeah, actually, that's where I was going to go to.
Awesome. Is we've talked a little bit about also how do we build the talent, right? How do we build the talent in the ecosystem? Reiki School has how many languages? 37, 42, a lot.
Okay.
A lot of languages. And the Portland schools particularly are incredibly diverse. And so we talked a little bit about how code camps are an on-ramp for, frankly, all kids, but particularly kids of color that might not have those aspirations, because they're all interested in technology regardless of their background. Can you talk a little bit about the impact that Iron Yard has had with you and what you've seen in your experience doing that work?
Sure. So on the ground in Atlanta, we have a couple of initiatives in play. One is called Code Start, C-O-D-E Start. And essentially, it's a partnership with our local workforce agency. So these are young men and women ages 18 to 24 that meet the federal guidelines for being what they call disconnected youth. That means they have barriers to opportunity. They come from low-income communities. They have to be City of Atlanta residents geographically. For this program, they have to at least be able to read on a 10th grade reading level, which is the TABE testing for the workforce world. This group had to have a high school diploma or GED, but could not have a college degree. So it was an experiment. We didn't want a group of kids that had computer science degrees that we were then teaching to code. Because I think if you're going to college to get a computer science degree, at some point you have to get a clue and start teaching yourself to code, which you can. There are a lot of people that are self-taught to code, and I'll tell you why they pick up on it easier than others. So Code Start is actually a 12-month program. The first 3 months are software engineering. They're learning Java, because in Atlanta today, for entry-level Java developers, there's about 1,000 openings, right? And so you kind of follow what the openings are in the market. And then they go through a month of career readiness, just interviewing skills. Technical interviewing is different from, traditional interviewing. Someone may ask you to code or solve a problem, and if you can't, how do you go figure it out? How do you learn something and then keep learning on top of that? So they learn that, and then once we get them placed in jobs or full-time internships, we take them through our pre-accelerator. So at the end, we're ultimately trying to create new technical co-founders, but if not, we want to get them good job placement. So that's Code Start. We worked in partnership with our workforce agency and local employers and the White House to be designated as Atlanta's, it was called a tech hire city, which is kind of this commitment to developing non-traditional talent and a new workforce for the future. On top of that, we've developed what's called the Tech Opportunity Fund, which is a 5-year, $100 million scholarship initiative whereby the Iron Yard has committed the first $40 million in scholarships. And you say, well, what does that mean? So the average cost of a coding boot camp is anywhere between $12,000 and $15,000. That's what it costs to go for that 3-month period of time, and some people just can't afford it because you can't work during that period of time. You can't go part-time. It's full-time. It's like 8 a.m. in the morning. You leave at 5 a.m. each day. You take some break, and you got homework sometimes to 12:1. I mean, and if you get behind, you fall off. And you got to keep up with it. And so one of the things that we noticed, so we're making that announcement either later this week or next week. We're trying to coordinate with the White House and everything. Everybody's trying to figure out what their next job is now, and it's a mess right now. I think they're having too much fun, right?
I think that's true.
But what we've noticed with this group is even though they don't have traditional college degrees, some of them do have some college though, is that they were picking up on programming and picking up on solving, like they wouldn't quit. Some of them were like, we get there, it's like get into the center maybe 8 in the morning, and a couple of them had stayed there all night where they were just not going to leave until they had solved something. Now, if they were to walk down the street with their hoodies on and their hair twisted up, you might have crossed the other side of the street just out of precaution, right? Just precaution, right? You would probably flip your purse on one side to the other side just to be precautious, or check your wallet, because that's how we are framed, right?
Yeah.
But these are software.
You blogged about one of your students.
I sure did. Well,
yeah.
So these students also receive housing from us. So we have them housed in a nice part of town called Ponce City Markets, and they get a monthly living stipend. And so real quickly, just to kind of talk about that, one of our students decided he was going to go to a check cashing outlet to cash his check, and we had warned them against going there. Most of them we helped set up bank accounts. That was even new to them. I mean, exposure, when people are inexposed, they're inexposed to so many things, but there's simple things that we take for granted. Banking, online banking, etc., Uber, whatever. But so he goes to this check cashing outlet, and the young lady, and this is the complexity of what we call institutionalized racism and bias, is the young lady on the other side at the check cashing outlet was also a black female. She didn't expect him to have a $500 check, so she basically, in essence, held the check, which is, she can do that, that's her right, but she also held illegally his ID. And she says, I'm not going to give you your ID back. You have to call the police to get your ID. So he basically was incriminating himself, because I'm calling the police because I can't get my ID back. He wasn't taught also how to effectively navigate the legal system, right? He didn't know his rights. He didn't know he could have called the police and reported his ID had been stolen. Cops would have arrived, probably different narrative altogether. Right. The unknown unknowns that so many people have when they have a lack of exposure across the board. And so anyway, I was in a very important meeting. I got a call, and it was like my resident director called and said, you got to get down here. I was like, well, I'm sure it's something that can wait, right? It was like, no, the cop. And I was like, what do you mean the cop? And it's like the cop is on the phone, and he wants to talk to me. So he gets somewhat of an attitude, and it's like, well, you need to come down here right away. And it's almost like he was trying to almost like incriminate me, like I must be in on this scam, right? This scam of giving kids these fake money orders, and they going in to cash them. And so I ended up going down, and just a lot of hostility from the cops, who also happen to be black, and the cashier. As well. And so, I'm here showing proof that I had these receipts, for, $7,500 worth of money orders that I had given out to students this month or what have you. But what it does, and I tweeted about it, and it just took off, and it became a tweet storm. And I had to release, because it was so much pain. Like, we're trying to help teach kids a skill that can give, like, they're not trying to do better. When you sign up for Code Camp and show up and start doing the work, you are doing better. Like a weekend, you know more about coding than the average person in the world knows about coding, right? Mm-hmm. So they weren't trying to do the right thing, they were doing the right thing, but they still were just being penalized and falling through the cracks, because, sometimes it's tough and difficult to kind of release those old habits. I don't think he should have went back to the check cashing outlet where he had an account. So he felt safe there. What he felt was a safe space. The moment that he had gotten an opportunity going back to that place, now he was a criminal. And so it's a lesson even to him that sometimes when you get an opportunity, you can't go back too quickly. I know you want to go back home. I know you want to go back to the hood, but sometimes you got to get stabilized. You got to get set up so that when you do go back, you know how to effectively navigate the culture from which you've not to say escaped, but in a sense, sometimes it is an escape for some of those kids. So it's our big experiment, because we've had to deal with stuff like that. We've had to deal with when they walk together 5, 10, 15 at a time, the cop cars will pull over and say, what are you guys doing in this area? And it's just, they're not just hacking code, they're hacking life, at the very same time. So on the other side of this, they have a skill. So the average entry-level Java programmer in America today, average, can make $62,500 a year. That's the average starting salary once you learn the code in that particular language. And then it kind of stacks on top of that. In 3 years, these students will have six-figure potential if they keep learning, if they get a paid internship that turns into a job or what have you. So we see it as a way to actually disrupt poverty and kind of close that wealth gap. That's why we're also giving them financial literacy training. You take someone, what's the song, 0 to 100? That if you take someone from 0 to $100,000, they don't understand the value of a dollar. They've never had a bank account. They don't understand, what credit is and what non-appreciating versus appreciating assets are. They'll just have, Mercedes-Benz with rims on them, and they'll, and not to be facetious, but to be honest, because they don't know any better. But it's just a weekend course on financial literacy can shift the trajectory of a person's life in general. So the macro statistics of that are, even when you look at kind of Portland and the rest of the country, by 2020 there's going to be a jobs gap of 1 million computing jobs. These are high growth jobs, 1 million computing jobs. Now that's sort of kind of like, you're like, wow, all of these positions are going to be open. Well, two things are going to happen. Either Americans are going to fill those jobs, or people from somewhere else are going to fulfill those jobs. So if we can teach someone, you can't tell me if I was a municipality or a foundation that I can invest $40,000 to $50,000. For us, it's $50,000 to house them, give them a living stipend, and give them a year's worth of training, which is less, by the way, than what it takes to house them in juvenile prison or in regular prison on an annual basis. So you can't tell me that investing $50,000 for somebody to make at least $50,000 and more over the course of their life is not a smart investment.
Right.
Now, it gets a little murky in there, because here's the reality. A entry-level programmer in probably about 10, 20 years is going to be the factory worker. That's going to be the factory worker of the future, because when Teslas and cities and drones are everywhere, and cities are being built with 3D printers. There are bridges in China today that 3D printers are building, and cities are being built. Parts of Teslas are built with 3D printers. But robots are only as smart today than those people who program. And now as machine learning and artificial intelligence evolves, they're now teaching robots to think for themselves. But then enters another form of bias, which was the Google experiment. So Google was teaching a robot to identify humans, but the programmer was only showing the robot white humans. And so when they showed him a black person, it said it was a gorilla. So for the future, you've got to have the diversity of people there to say, wait a minute, I'm a human too. We need to scan 10,000 images of this person as well. And so that new factory worker, there are going to be some new factory workers here. So that same software engineer that can build a billion-dollar software company, when you talk about the democratization of skills, that coder is going to be required for you to, those coding skills are going to be required for you to simply function in the new society. You won't be able to get basic work without being able to program robots and tell the robots in this connected universe of devices. It can be scary, you can be unplugged or plugged, but when you go into the workforce for efficiency purposes, they're going to be using more robots. That's why a factory in China just ordered 46,000 robots. robots and have replaced, well, those are very poor jobs anyway, so I think that's a good thing. But what happens when robots start placing, like we have this big debate now about immigrants, foreign immigrants taking our jobs. Well, what happens when robots start taking the jobs? Now we have another, and now we're talking about the Matrix type stuff, right? So, but that's the context. So as early as possible, you got to make the argument to your foundations, to your philanthropists, even to your tech initiatives who are looking for the technical co-founders of the future, your investors, your politicians, to say we've got to introduce coding as early as K. And then parents, the responsibility on parents to also look at the resources as well, even if the schools don't offer it. There's so many free resources online where you can introduce your children, your niece, your nephew, your son or daughter, what have you, to coding as well, so they can start being acclimated to the culture of it. And that's why by the time they become teenagers or go on to college or work or whatever, they've been tinkering for so long that their minds are nimble enough to pick up and learn new things.
Right.
Yeah.
We only have 10 minutes left. Yeah. It's gone really by. I mean, I have more questions, but I wanted to give the audience time for questions as well. So, yeah. This one back there. Oops.
Rodney, I followed you from Atlanta.
I know, man. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Rodney, I wanted you to speak really quickly towards, as you were building your own companies from the ground up, what kind of mentors, not necessarily your team, but what kind of mentors did you bring on, and then how were you intentional about them also being diverse in their backgrounds and skill sets?
Sure. So they're mentors and they're also advisors. So 16 years ago, when this whole startup ecosystem jargon didn't really mean much because people weren't talking about it. As a co-founder, you had to find some type of network to plug in. And so I really wasn't intentional about developing mentors, but I was very keen on finding formal advisors to be a part of my company. And formal advisors are usually people who they don't volunteer their time in exchange for small amounts of equity in your company. It could be a quarter of a point, a half a point, or a point, or what have you. And most times it's like volunteerism, because if most startups fail, then that equity means nothing anyway. But if it does turn into something, it is kind of a hat tip for their time. But usually, so I was in a particular industry, right? So we were selling, streaming services in some shape, form, or software to faith-based organizations and nonprofits initially, and then we expanded from there. So the first thing we did was we had an advisor who had built a company before, and they had built a new media, as we called it back then, a new media company. We got to the point one time where actually Michael Bay was one of our advisors. He was on our board of advisors. But so we had someone with kind of this iconic status that was also into the future but had a large network, which was very important. So boom, they get a formal advisory seat. Then there could be someone that has industry domain into the weeds, like that's that scientist, that person who is always studying the evolution of what you've created to make it better as well. So having kind of that person involved as well. What I don't recommend in terms of formal advisor positions are having service providers as advisors. Accountants and lawyers play a very, very important place in terms of helping you to do your operating agreement, do your convertible note, maybe even do your offering agreements and prospectus or what have you. But sometimes there could be a conflict of interest in placing them on the advisory board. You've got to have them, but they always are not a good fit on that advisory board. But look for that diversity there. And here again, whether it's at the co-founding level, whether it's at the team level, because sometimes before you have a team, you have advisors. Because if you can't afford to hire a team because you haven't done your family and friends or your seed round yet, it's the co-founders, then it's the advisors. And, did we have the World Wide Web 16 years ago? Absolutely. Did I build a business on it? relatively big business. I thought it was, at least. Yes, but today we have LinkedIn. We have all these social media constructs. We have these ecosystems, and you can plug into kind of the main startup ecosystem, but then that connects you to 25 different ecosystems. You might have to get on a plane or get in a car and leave and go meet more people rather than just trying to build here. I mean, at the end of the day, the state and Maine and the ecosystem only cares that most of your cap table stays here. Because that's what the wealth is. When investors come in, they take wealth out. They take wealth out of your company on the cap table. But if the majority of the cap table is here until you raise, tons of capital. Like we've got 2 portfolio companies now. One is called Pindrop in Atlanta. One is called Ionic. Pindrop has raised over $120 million. Ionic has raised over $100 million. We don't own the majority of those companies in a way, but it's a great trade-off in terms of what we do own and the growth capital that's provided. But getting outside of your comfort zone, and we talked a lot about this, Shakir, I think before you came in the room, is how do you dig deeper into networks that are existing here? But if you're not clicking here, if you can't find your co-founder here, guess what? You may need to drive down to Boston, drive to New York.
Not Massachusetts. It's so far, 2 hours.
Did I miss something?
No.
But my point is getting it done and building that high growth company means, like for instance, if a Silicon Valley investor, and we've experienced this, came today, and we've been pretty good at keeping our companies in Atlanta, but it's taken a lot of negotiation to keep our startups there. But if we lose one for the team to get that wealth back after the exit, then we did it. Because I'd rather have that exited entrepreneur back in Atlanta, back in Portland, Maine, that now wants to contribute to the ecosystem. So I think even as ecosystem builders, as parents, Jess, sometimes we have to be willing, and I kind of say that just, kind of metaphorically, we have to be willing to release our startup children into the startup universe and know that one day they will actually come back home, because there will be some mentor, someone that changed their life, or some cause that they're connected to, or it might just be the parents or the grandparents that they want to be around.
If we make it quick, I think we have time for another
and I'll
question
keep my answers short
Nick.
going forward.
Hi.
And-
So we're talking about inclusive code camps and like building the factory workers of the future. What about the factory owners of the future? So thinking about income inequality, the argument for inclusion for competitive advantage is like incredibly powerful. I've heard like executives at Microsoft and other big companies saying things that only activists were saying a couple of decades ago, even just 5 years ago even. It's amazing. But what about this sort of income? Even if you have people making $60,000 a year at basic level, plus maybe some basic income would be nice for the robots, whatever. What about the people who own the company who are making millions? You're still going to have this income inequality. So what about VCs? Like, what about more inclusion in VCs? Because that's really the elephant in the room, is like, if all the people controlling the money are still not diverse, does it matter? And so is there any initiatives like to deal with like getting people to be VCs, getting people to not just be the basic entry level, but actually go to take the reins of the money itself?
That was one of the topics on the list of questions that we discussed that we didn't get to.
So, I mean, again, I'll talk experientially, right? So, across America today, there are probably 8, and I just added another person, 8 African-American venture capitalists, where they're the general partners, not just a principal, but they're the GPs of those funds. And there's a lot I won't go into in terms of the why that is so. I mean, we got to look back at the racial wealth gap. We also got to look at opportunities in C-suites. We got to look at, there's so many dynamics to why. A lot of it is exposure too. I think with more exposure, there could be more. But when you become a GP, of a fund, like with the fund we have in Atlanta, thank God I'm not the GP. The fiduciary duty you have to LPs, I mean, you really can do nothing except that. Period. So I do think there needs to be some democratization at that level. What we've done in particular, so I'll tell you what we did at Atlanta, at TechSquare Labs. We created a syndicate, which was basically a group of accredited African-American investors who had never invested in a startup or a fund, but were intrigued with tech. So the minimum investment in our fund is $250,000, right? So I wasn't going to take a $25,000 or $50,000 check from someone. We created a syndicate that basically we pool those investors together, and now we've got them in the ecosystem. Okay, so they're in the game. So when we have an LP meeting, I'm not going to take a group of 10 guys to the LP meeting, but quarterly I'll bring one person so that they can start talking to, our largest LP are the Yancey brothers that own Caterpillar, right? So, those are ways, tangible ways that you can take smaller investors and kind of launch a syndicate or what have you. Not knowing, the data, less than 1% of venture and angel money goes to African Americans, less than 1% to Latinos, and less than 4 to 5 goes to women. So there's a lot that has to happen. I think you've got to get more people into VC as analysts working in the firms. They can influence the general partners or what have you as more data comes out, as more wealth is created from diverse entrepreneurs that have exits. Look at what Kay Koplovich is doing with Springboard. I'm on their board. I'm the only male in the Superwoman's Club, literally, right? So they wanted diversity as well, so they kind of loop back around full circle. Kay Koplovich and Springboard, they've helped women founders raise over $6.2 billion through their accelerator. So you're starting to see these, 500 startups just brought on Monique Woodard as a partner, and Monique they filed to do a $25 million venture fund focused on diverse co-founders. So we're seeing pockets of that. Locally, write a short list of all those CEOs. Now, I'm not going to say, if they make that and they've earned that, America's still built on capitalist principles, right? What they do with their post-tax money, you really can't tell a man or woman what to do. All you can do is appeal to their altruism or appeal to their greed. It's two things. Do you want to make more money or do you want to give back? And so maybe as a collective, you decide to go in and say, if Jess is that representative, whoever that is, go in and meet with them. Those CEOs, those companies do what? A lot of them pay taxes. One of the ways to decrease your taxes is through research and development. You expense it. Out of R&D, you can invest in new technologies. You can invest in seed funds, in venture funds. You just have to show people another way. If there's $2.5 billion in foundation money that's here, then there should probably be a $25 million fund. There should probably be a $10 million diversity fund. You want to attract diverse co-founders here, they'll pack up and come here like the gold rush if you invest in them. Because raising capital is so tough and so hard. So, but I would, whatever you do, you want to be intentional. You want to have a strategy. If everybody's kind of like going after this person, 5,000 here, 10,000 here, no. What's the big initiative that you agree on, and say, what are we missing in this ecosystem? Do we have enough seed funds here? Okay, because venture capitalists are usually going to follow the seed funds, guys. And the seed funds are following the angels, and the angels are following the family and friends. And if you can't kind of link that investment ecosystem from your own money in all the way to that institutional money, they're looking back saying, give me a thumbs up on this company. Have you done your due diligence? Have you done your due diligence? Have you done your due diligence? So if you got gaps in your investment ecosystem, I think between your large corporates and your foundations and your government, you want to try to solve that there.
Wow. So actually, quick answer to that. So Susan Morris would be mad at me if I didn't mention this, but Friday morning at Red Thread, there's an event being put on by a number of women leaders in the community.
Okay.
It's for women who might be accredited investors, who are interested in learning. They're sort of startup curious.
Curious.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's at Red Thread at 7:30? 7 a.m.
Women want 7 till 9 to get everything done.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Okay.
Wow.
Good deal.
Access to capital on Thursday.
And then there's an Access to Capital forum put on by CEI. What time is that at? 5:30 on Thursday.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I don't know about you all, but Rodney's given us a lot to think about, and I really think we should give it up for him one more time.